Shalom, all praises, blessings, glories, and honors to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Racha, Kodash. Double honors to my elder apostles and bishop elders of Great Millstone, who have taught me this truth, as well of men of like mind. Shalom wa chasad, which means peace and mercy, to the elect of the nation of Israel, whom you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native American Indians, and Israelite foreigners of the seed of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom are scattered here in America, which is Babylon the Great, and abroad. And to you I say Shalom, and Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Ratazah. This lesson is edifying and informative. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 5. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, and evil, and only evil, behold, is come. An end is come. The end is come. It watcheth for thee. Behold, it is come. Verse 25. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 3. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 26. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest, and counsel from the ancients. In the news, various articles from the RT. Russia to withdraw from arms treaty. President Putin has appointed an official to supervise the country's exit from the suspended 1990 Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. Russia has indicated its intention to formally withdraw from the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, CFE, a military transparency agreement that is currently suspended. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov has been selected by President Vladimir Putin to supervise the procedure in the Russian parliament. The appointment was revealed on Wednesday as part of regular Kremlin announcements. Ryabkov will represent the government in both chambers of parliament regarding the proposed withdrawal, the document said. Leonid Slutsky, the leader of the nationalist LDPR party, told RIA Novosti that a draft law on Russia's withdrawal from the treaty could be introduced as early as this week. The CFE treaty was one of the cornerstones of the attempted de-escalation of tensions between the Warsaw Pact bloc and NATO during the final days of the USSR. Signed in 1990, the agreement set limits for deployment of conventional forces on the European continent and established various transparency mechanisms such as on-site verification inspections, especially toward nuclear facilities, which, by the way, Russia had recently left a nuclear pact between itself and the U.S. Moscow has long complained that the expansion of the U.S.-led military bloc, which included the accession of former members of the Warsaw Pact, was undermining the treaty. What you need to know about the U.S.-Russia nuclear treaty that Moscow suspended. So they didn't actually leave it; they had suspended it. In 2007, Russia announced a partial suspension of the CFE, citing the failure of the new NATO members to subject their military forces to limits specified in the treaty. Moscow fully withdrew from the CFE mechanism in 2015, saying it saw no purpose in continued participation. In February, Russia suspended participation in the New START, the last bilateral nuclear arms reduction agreement with the U.S. The Russian government accused Washington of using the Ukraine military as a proxy force to attack airfields that host Russian long-range nuclear-capable bombers, and of blocking Russian inspections of U.S. nuclear facilities. The U.S. previously withdrew from several other treaties with Russia that were aimed at ensuring strategic stability. In 2002, President George W. Bush pulled his country out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, claiming the U.S. needed a national defense system to defend itself from rogue states. The administration of Donald Trump put an end to the Treaty on Open Skies, which allowed participants to conduct air surveillance of foreign militaries. It also quit the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Notice that within the past year, if not all these treaties, most of them have been either suspended or broken. So the Lord is mustering the host of the battle. The Lord is storing up the minds of these different kings and leaders and high officials across the globe in preparation for the third world's woe, which cometh quickly, according to Revelation chapter 11, verse 14. And this will come after the mark of the beast, which is the RFID microchip, has been mandated globally, which bans certain land-based missiles considered to pose a risk of unintentional nuclear conflict. Nuclear conflict cannot and will not be avoided, because again, according to biblical prophecy, in the book of Revelation, 11th chapter, the 14th verse, the second war is past, and behold, the third war cometh quickly. A woe, a destruction, a war that, according to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5, will be fought with burning and fuel of fire. For as it is written, for every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood. But this shall be with burning and fuel of fire. That is written in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 5, roughly paraphrasing the scripture. And according to Joel, the 3rd chapter, the Lord is waking up these mighty men, all the men of war, because we are in a time of war. We are in a season of war, according to Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, the 8th verse. So this concludes the article. Now let's move on to the next. UK food prices skyrocket. Data. Soaring costs for basic essentials have led to a decline in living standards in the country. British households have been hit with a record jump in food prices as decades-high inflation continues to cripple the economy, according to the latest figures from the British Retail Consortium, BRC. A report by the trade body, which represents UK supermarkets, showed on Tuesday that fresh food prices soared by 17.8% in April on an annual basis, while prices for tinned goods and other store cupboard items accelerated by 12.9%. According to the BRC Nielsen IQ Shop Price Index, prices were up 8.8% last month compared to the same period in the previous year, while slightly down from 8.9% in March. Overall, shop price inflation eased slightly in April due to heavy spring discontinuing in clothing, footwear, and furniture. BRC Chief Executive Helen Dickinson was quoted as saying by Sky News. However, food prices remain elevated given ongoing cost pressures throughout the supply chain, she added. Dickinson indicated that some goods, such as ready meals, have been seeing price rises due to the knock on effect from increased production and packaging costs. Meanwhile, head of retail and business inside of Nielsen IQ, Mike Watkins, noted that with inflation yet to peak in sales volumes mostly in decline, it's difficult to second guess the strength of consumer confidence. Why? Because even in the U.S., consumer has been spending a lot of money. It says officials, which is only fueling inflation. And look at the interest rate, the level of interest right now, about 5%. Or I guess a little bit above that. I would have to go back and check, but nonetheless, it's around 5%. And it will only go up even more because people continue to spend. But they're doing it like that on purpose because they know that eventually a recession will have to happen and will come in the near future. It says officials' figures showed last month that the rate of inflation in Britain had eased slightly but still remains above 10%, with food and drink costs at a 45-year high. According to the Trussell Trust charity, almost 3 million emergency food parcels have been rendered out at UK food banks in the past year, with the number provided by children topping 1 million for the first time. The Bank of England's chief economist, Wade Pearl, stated earlier that British households and businesses needed to accept that they are poor and should stop asking for wage increases and pushing prices higher. Damn. Woo-wee. Goodness. Eurozone inflation rising. As that had concluded the article. Consumer prices driven by food, drink, and energy costs keep climbing across the single currency area. Eurozone inflation surged to 7% in April, in the first increase in the last 5 months. Data released by the European Union Statistics Office Eurostat on Tuesday showed. Consumer prices rose from 6.9% in March, driven by food prices that soared 13.6% year-on-year last month. Food, alcohol, and tobacco are expected to have the highest annual rate in April, followed by non-energy industrial goods, which picked up 6.2%. Services climbed by 5.2% in April, compared with 5.1% the previous month. Energy prices were up again by 2.5% after a slight decline by 0.9% in March, according to the report. Core inflation, excluding food and energy prices, declined from 5.7% in March to 5.6% in April. The figures are closely watched by European Central Bank policymakers, who will decide whether to continue raising interest rates, which they will, to curb inflation when they meet on Thursday. Latvia continues to struggle with the highest inflation at 15%, followed by Slovakia, Lithuania, and Ireland, all dealing with a double-digit surge in consumer prices among the 20-member Eurozone. Inflation in Germany, the EU's biggest economy, declined by 7.6% in April from 7.8% in March. In France, however, consumer prices rose 6.9% last month, up from 6.7% in March, Eurostat said. While the ECB has not committed to a new rate hike, the latest figures make it more likely, economists warn. The key deposit rate in the Eurozone stands at 3%. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) recently said that taming inflation while avoiding a recession was the biggest challenge the EU will face in months to come. And then Hyperinflation is inevitable and a recession is unavoidable. That concludes the article. In other headlines, Biden fears for U.S. reputation. Former UK premier to visit Taiwan. That will obviously fuel China. And in other news from the Sputnik, what should Americans brace for on the brink of default? Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen recently warned that unless the congressional limit on the country's debt servicing is raised by June 1st, the U.S. government will likely begin defaulting on its debt. With a U.S. default scenario grabbing global headlines, Sputnik has reached out to renowned experts to ask them about possible implications of the potential default and what ordinary Americans should do if it happens. What is the 2023 U.S. default all about? Fabrizio Carmignani, professor of economics and dean of Graffiti Business School, explained that this year, the risk of default for American Aries, not because U.S. debt is unsustainable in absolute terms, but because of the legislative ceiling that is set on the amount of national debt that can be incurred by the Treasury. Based on expenditure forecasts, both the key Congressional Budget Office and the U.S. Department of Treasury suggest that debt is rapidly approaching the legislative ceiling. If the ceiling is not raised, then the U.S. Treasury might no longer be able to pay its bills as of June the 1st, 2023, a warning that was earlier issued by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Will the U.S. default on its debt? Despite the fact that the increase in the U.S. debt ceiling is being negotiated between the Biden administration and Congress, these talks seem to have reached a deadlock, and this is what is now fueling concerns about a possible default, according to Carmignani. The current U.S. debt ceiling is due to be reached by the end of this month, which leaves the U.S. government little time to negotiate extension or suspension. Even so, a last-minute agreement is expected to be reached at the end of the day. Even if the U.S. hits the debt ceiling now, the default will be brief, as it is not in the interest of the administration nor in the interest of Congress to have a protracted default. So, one might be looking at a sharp but short-lived shock, he added. Will there be repercussions? Carmignani also warned that if the U.S. effectively comes to a default, and there would likely be some significant consequences in America and worldwide. First of all, millions of Americans who rely on federal payments, e.g. salaries, federal programs, etc., will be possibly left without income. In fact, who and what the government would still be able to pay after the default is unclear. There is a 1996 law that could allow the Treasury to continue to pay Social Security benefits, but payments and obligations such as Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and housing assistance would most likely have to be stopped. Military salaries and principal and interest payments on at least some U.S. Treasury securities might also have to be stopped. He also echoed by Chris Devonshire Ellis, chairman of Dizan, Shair and Associates, who predicted that in the event of a default, the U.S. will suffer a serious blow to its physical credibility. When government facilities will close with no funds to keep them open, this in turn may lead to strikes and potentially serious social problems, all of which will boost former U.S. President Donald Trump's appeal despite his own legal troubles. The default will also most likely raise the cost of U.S. borrowing and make it more difficult and expensive for the U.S. to further borrow money. Shares are likely to fall dramatically, while the U.S. dollar will also depreciate. Gold and other precious commodities can be expected to rise in price. Planned U.S. investment into infrastructure such as the Build Back Better scheme may cease. Foreign governments may start to ask for the return of their assets held in the U.S., such as gold and currency reserves. In addition to the stop in payment, the default could have broader systematic consequences. U.S. Treasury bonds would be downgraded, leading to an increase in interest rates and a decrease in their value. This in turn would affect the balance sheet of companies, both financial and non-financial institutions. Pardon me. That hold Treasury securities. The potential consequences would be some form of liquidity shortage, especially if banks decide to hoard cash. Ultimately, there is an increased risk of recession, with contraction in GDP, gross domestic product, and increase in unemployment. It is also reasonable to expect that the decline in equity prices and the contraction recession in the U.S. would trigger adverse effects worldwide, with global stock markets and economies following the U.S. And that's pretty much the point. So I will leave the rest of this article in the description box of the lesson. Now let's get the scriptures and then conclude the lesson. Abaratazah. Again, this is the book of Ezekiel, chapter 7, verse 25. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. Right, so in the times of destruction, people will attempt to seek peace, but there shall be none. And when they're going to be promised peace, that's when destruction which cometh will come upon them suddenly, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. Remember, it is written in the book of 2nd Ezra, the 8th chapter, that many great miseries shall come upon them, that in the latter times shall dwell upon the earth, because they have walked in great pride. And according to 2nd Ezra, the 15th chapter, the cities are going to be troubled, and men shall be afraid because of their pride. So the Lord is about to bring judgment upon the world because of the pride of the people, especially, in particular, the pride of 2/3 of the nation of Israel. There's a majority that makes up women that live in these metros, these mother cities. And then you have you proud ass niggas, man. You have proud heathens, proud Edomites. But the Lord's going to put all that to rest, to cease. It says, mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Bad news after bad news. Despair after despair for the wicked. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priests, and counsel from the ancients. So people won't be able to find the words of Yahweh B'Shem Yahushua. You won't be able to find the prophets on the internet nor on the highways and hedges. Because during those times, the Lord's going to cut off access to his words. Thus, there will be the famine of the word. So with that, I will conclude this lesson. This has been another in the news. Lord's willing, it was informative, edifying to the elect. Until the next, Lord's willing, I say shalom to the elect.